It's easy to picture people following Jesus because he always seems to be going somewhere. Great multitudes troop along behind him. Crowds throng about him. The disciples stumble after him in continual confusion, often wondering where they are going or why they are even following. In short, a carnival-like atmosphere swirls about Jesus. I've sometimes wondered what would have happened if some archaeologist had found in a cave an old parchment that proved that Matthew was actually a seminary graduate. The conversation and the scenario might have gone something like this. As Jesus was walking along, he saw a man sitting at the tax office whose name was Matthew. And he said to him, "Follow me." And Matthew said, let's see, it comes from the Greek word akaluthe, a contract verb, second person singular, present active imperative. And Jesus says, no, wait a minute, just follow me. And he said, well, in most cases, it generally means follow, except for the exception. Jesus said, just follow me. And after having had a year of clinical pastoral education, Matthew said, what I hear you saying is that you have a need for someone to follow you. But of course, we know that Matthew was not a seminary graduate. He was an IRS man, one of the most hated professions in Palestine, one of those tax collectors who skimmed off the top and gave the rest to Rome. He wasn't one of the fishermen that Jesus found knee-deep in nets. No, he was a little more like you and me, just going along with life. And all of a sudden, God has called us as well. And perhaps like Matthew, we have friends and good secular friends who don't think of Jesus as any more than a bearded man in a stained glass window and wonder why we're wasting our time with all this church stuff in a post-Christendom era. What's gotten into Matthew? People must have said. Has he lost his mind that he just got up and went and followed this street preacher? I imagine Matthew as very businesslike, very thorough, very precise. I imagine him with a CPA. He's got an MBA. He is a person who calculates everything down to the last penny. He doesn't even do lunch without first doing due diligence. He doesn't do anything spontaneously. In fact, he would make a very good Presbyterian, Has to stop and study it and have a committee and think about it. He's quiet. He's discerning. He's not easily swayed by sweaty shirt oratory. He's not converted at every revival like some people in other denominations. He doesn't get easily excited and running around saying, Jesus, Jesus, Jesus. No, he's like a good, quiet Presbyterian in control of his emotions. Some Lutherans even have more joy than some Presbyterians. Someone once imagined Luther and Calvin standing at the foot of the cross, just looking at Jesus, and suddenly Luther begins jumping up and down and leaping and yelling, "Praise the Lord, I'm saved, I'm saved." And Calvin says, "Shut up, Martin, I'm trying to think about this." That's a good Presbyterian response, the kind that Matthew would have offered. Thus, everyone was surprised by his sudden impetuousness. What's gotten into Matthew? It has to be more than just the mesmerizing grin of this young street preacher. There has to be something more going on that we can't quite tell from this one little verse. Maybe he'd made it big financially. He'd gotten to the top of his profession, and yet he was still unhappy with his life because suddenly he realized money wasn't everything. Oh, it's good, but it wasn't everything. Maybe he was just going through a midlife crisis where he came into a synagogue one day and he was He was trying to find something more fulfilling than all the fancy things that he had bought. My guess is that there are Matthews filling every church here across the country looking for something more than they can find in their stock portfolios. And Christ comes by, as he does for all of us, sooner or later, down your street and to your house and to mine. Or maybe it happens in a worship service through a line in a hymn or an anthem, or maybe a phrase in a prayer, or an endearing glance from a child, or a kind word spoken before or after church. I don't know, but suddenly something happens that gets our attention. Something happened that got Matthew's attention. It was like Jesus had slapped him across the face and he had to start all over. It almost turned him upside down. It's not that tax collecting in itself was bad. I mean, people in those days had to live, to get by, had to make it. But sometimes good, honest people are thrust into unethical dealings just to make it. I've done ethics consulting for corporations, and I've seen how hard the questions are that business leaders have to deal with every single day. Maybe someone like Matthew was forced in such a difficult way into making gray area decisions that, like the German officer in Sophie's Choice, he had long ago forgotten the difference between right and wrong, and he had lost his compass, his moral compass, and he was adrift. Or maybe he had come to terms with his own racism. Maybe he realized that thinking about Charleston as just a blip in the news was wrong, that there is something that is permeating our culture. Maybe he began realizing all of that. I don't know. But in a world where everyone despised him because of his own sin, and perhaps where he had become aware of his own deep sin, suddenly now there was this young man who seemed so wise and so confident, who looked him in the eyes and accepted him as a child of God in a way no one had ever accepted him before. The way Jesus looks in your eyes and mine this morning and accepts us and says, "You, now, come on, let's go. I want you, now." There was something persistent about this one called Jesus, the way he said, "Now, let's go." If you read Mark's gospel especially, you find the word immediately, a Greek word euthus, just used everywhere because there was a sense of urgency about Jesus. Now, my dad used to say when I was a little boy, "Come on, immediately, if not sooner." You know, this was the way Jesus spoke. And Matthew got up and went, just like that. I wonder why. I'd like to think, as some commentators speculate, that that Matthew had heard Jesus before. He had stood on the edge of the crowd when Jesus fed the fishes and the loaves to the 5,000. He had observed all this. Or maybe he had peeked in on the wedding party at the wedding at Cana and watched Jesus turn water into wine. Or maybe he had become so overwhelmed with who this Jesus was that he had begun to rethink his life, that there was something more than he had experienced before. I don't know. The text doesn't say any of that. All it says is that he got up and went. Now, in the recent sermons I've given to you, it seems like we keep coming across this got up word. It's the Greek word anastasis. It means resurrection. This is the resurrection word hidden right in this tiny little verse. Matthew got up. He just got up and went. But why? What got hold of him that caused him to do that? Well, it's the same thing that got hold of you and me long ago, or maybe needs to get hold of you if it hasn't up to this point. It's what got hold of C.S. Lewis, who describes his conversion as the steady unrelenting of the one who would not let him go. Or Lauren Winner, who teaches Christian spirituality at Duke University, the daughter of an Orthodox Jewish father and a lapsed Southern Baptist mother. And then she converted to Orthodox Judaism, but later converted to Christianity because she could not resist the determination of the young carpenter from Nazareth. She talks about it in her wonderful book, Girl Meets God, One Path on a Spiritual Pilgrimage. What is it that gets us, that causes us to come to God? We don't know. It's just that God grabs us. I think of the numbers of women and men who crammed into my Greek classes at Union Seminary, or all the classes I've ever taught in seminaries around the country or around the world. They have left good jobs to come and slog through Greek and Hebrew and exegesis and theology and church history and ethics. What gets into them? What gets into you that you joined this church long ago, or maybe more recently, or that you became an elder or a deacon or a teacher or a member of the choir? What gets into us that we want to come and be a part of this ministry of Jesus Christ? It's not easy. I mean, just ask Abraham and Sarah, who are told they're going to have a baby in the retirement community, and Medicare's going to pick up the tab. I mean, look at Jonah, who was supposed to go to Nineveh, but he goes the other direction to Tarshish. Or Jeremiah, who says, I'm just too young, Lord. Or Mary, when the angel Gabriel says to her in the Annunciation, you're going to deliver the Savior of the world. And she goes, how can this be? It's not easy to follow Christ. Not easy to bring Christ to the world. And sometimes it happens too fast. It just comes upon us suddenly. It's like the story of the golfer who was out playing one day and his first shot went into the woods. And so he lined up his second shot between two trees. And when he took it, it hit one of the trees, bounced back, hit him in the forehead, and he's standing now at the pearly gates. And St. Peter says, are you a good golfer? He says, I got here in two. Sometimes it happens. I see some golfers, you guys really like that one, I can tell. It happens too fast. And yet, no matter how fast it happens, it takes a lifetime for us to learn how to follow Jesus. It takes some of us a long time to figure out what we're really supposed to do in our lives. I guess I was supposed to come here long ago, and it's just taken me a long time to figure that out. There's a kind of divine bookending symmetry to this whole thing as we start this ministry together, because my wife Jane knew Felix Yarborough when she was in middle school up in Tennessee, and she used to talk about Felix Yarborough, what a fun guy he is. And then we knew Carl Murray back years ago when he used to come up to Mountain Homes near where Jane's mother and father had a cabin. And we used to hear about IPC. We're talking back in the 70s and early 80s. And then I came to do the stewardship dinner. Had to follow a Mark Twain impersonator. I've never done that before. I followed an Elvis Presley impersonator, but never a Mark Twain. This was like the late 80s or early 90s. Scott McClure was still here. I knew Scott. I know John McClure very well, homiletics professor. I've known all your pastors and interim pastors, Morgan Roberts from way back, Jerry Shetler from way back. There's a kind of divine bookending symmetry here, and yet it's taken me a long time to figure out. You all have been recruiting me my whole life to come as your pastor. Sometimes it takes God just sort of cracking us on the head to get our attention. So, it was 20 years ago and then 10 years ago. So this time I'm walking with the pastor nominating committee around here in the sanctuary a few months ago and trying to decide, Lord, I said, I need a sign. You're going to have to tell me that this is what I'm supposed to do. And Teresa Pulliam said, we need to walk back behind here and let's go see where the acolytes have their robes. I love how the acolytes wear their robes, she said. And we opened it and closed it and looked. And then she said, it's really right. This is right this time. She was on the search committee 10 years ago, and she said, Bill, it's right this time. I said, yeah, I'm looking for a sign. And so I said, I'll walk out through this chapel. I want to go here. And she said, that's fine. I'll meet you around. But she didn't tell me there's a very low threshold right over here. Now, I think she did that on purpose because I cracked my head good and hard. And I came stumbling into the sanctuary and looked up and I said, okay, Lord, I get the point. I'm supposed to come. I heard the voice, follow me, and this time I did. Thanks be to God.